it kind of goes to show you like it is like people are kind of like ready to like either bail or like we're like deep in this AI bubble now for a company to be worth like 3 trillion and to have grown so fast into that. Hello everyone, welcome to the Founders in Arms podcast with me, Imad, founder and CEO of Mercury.
And I'm Raj Suri. I'm the co-founder of several startups, including Lyft, Presto, Lima, and Tribe. And great to be chatting today. There's a lot to talk about, Imad. Big news over the past few days was about the arrest of Pavel Durov, the CEO and founder of Telegram, who I guess is around the same age as us. He's around 39. He's kind of famous for sticking up his middle finger at the authority, and he gave Putin the bird, left Russia in 2014. I think he already started a successful company in Russia called VKontakte, and then he started Telegram, but the Russians tried to shut down Telegram, so he just left. He went to Dubai. This app is well used, 900 million users around the world, and a lot of people use it for one-on-one messaging, but there's a lot of big communities on there. A lot of armies use it. A lot of government officials use it.
Yeah, and the key here is that because it's encrypted, right? Like the reason people like it and are drawn to it is that it's encrypted, and like its promise is that like you can do anything on it, and like no one can like spy on it.
It's actually not end-to-end encrypted. It's only it's not default encrypted like WhatsApp. It's you can go and pick encryption. But if you send a message on Telegram today, it won't be encrypted. It's actually stored in plain text in the servers. So it's relatively easy to hack from that perspective.
Well, I guess if you care about privacy, you do encrypt it. So, I mean, it's
Yes.
probably the encrypted set of the traffic that like is under question here and why he was arrested.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is that because they're like not based in any country, they're not subject to those countries' laws. So it's somewhat lawless as well. Yeah, so I think that's another appeal for a lot of people is that it's not subject to any laws, and they know the company is not going to cooperate with the government.
He's actually a French national, so he went back to France and got arrested. Apparently, there was a long-standing arrest warrant. There's obviously like tons of rumors around this. Like someone was saying that Macron invited him back, and he didn't expect to get arrested, and he got arrested as soon as he showed up. Macron actually ended up denying that, so may just be a made-up thing. He's also a really interesting guy. He says he's had more than 100 babies because he's a sperm donor.
Wow.
I think that part of the reason it's like interesting to people is that like he's an interesting guy. He's a billionaire. There's a attack on free speech, according to some people. We had a kind of a short argument about it where like, I guess like there's a question of like, should someone be an encryption absolutist in the sense that like, hey, if two people want to talk and it's encrypted, like they should be allowed to do that, and like it's their choice. Yeah, I mean, some people will, be doing the good kind of rebellion, right? Like they'll be in an authoritative country like Russia, and they'll be talking about like potentially improving their lives, and other people will be doing the bad type. I kind of feel like people should be allowed to have private conversations, and like, yes, there'll be like some bad stuff, and we should go after that bad stuff with the law, but we shouldn't ban like the ability to have private conversations.
Yeah, I think they're not, the argument here is not banning the ability to have private conversations. The argument is if there's real evidence, if it passes a high standard of like proof that, some conversations enable the breaking of the law, which is like, for example, passing around of child porn or enabling, child sex rings. Should the company have to cooperate and hand over what they have to the government? And you can argue that it's in society's interest to be stopping heinous crimes.
I mean, that's fine, but like, what Russia considers a heinous crime is different from what France does. And if you're building a global app, like actually like the heinous crimes that France thinks might be the Russian government using Telegram, right? Like, and we don't really know. Like, it's very easy to go after people by saying like child porn, but like we don't really know what the motives are here. This is the tricky part with these global apps, right? Like if it's just operating in one country, you could say, hey, yes, like you have to obey the laws of that country. Even perfectly good countries with strong free speech laws like the US, do things that infringe on people's like privacy often, right? Like we had the whole NSA stuff that like Edward Snowden kind of revealed. So, my preference would be that Powell literally couldn't do anything to reveal private encrypted information. So I think the fact that you're saying that, they do have a lot of unencrypted stuff. I mean, if they do, they probably have to obey the laws of the countries they're in, right? Ideally, it's like, hey, everything's encrypted. Yeah, maybe they have metadata, but it is a little weird to me that like he is withholding unencrypted information and not obeying the laws of the countries they operate in.
Yeah, and not responding to subpoenas. I think that if someone subpoenas you, you have to, if you don't have the information, you just tell them, guys, I don't have this. But if you don't respond at all, that's not a good thing, and no government will be happy with that. I mean, there's some precedents here, right? So, the terrorist in LA who shot like 11 people, he had some information stored on his iPhone, and Apple kind of refused to help the U.S. government, and then eventually the U.S. government actually hacked into the phone using some Israeli technology,
some zero-day
right?
exploit. I thought that was interesting. I think that's like, I guess we can shift the conversation to like, does Europe just have much weaker free speech and judicial protection behind this? Because Apple obviously refused to do it. They went to court and they won. My impression is the US does have free speech as part of the Constitution, and it's like, even in like fairly heinous situations, willing to protect it. Whereas I don't think that's the case in Europe.
In that case, right, Apple was protecting its right to not share its encryption algorithm, right?
Well, they were not willing to like reveal the private key and I guess, or just unencrypt the data. But this came up recently because the UK has been arresting people who promote the riots in any way, like even like talking about like people meeting up to protest. Like there's a few arrests for that kind of thing, and all of that's being put under this hate speech law that the UK has. As far as I know, in the US, like you're probably not going to get arrested, whereas in the UK, that's like an arrestable event. Do we think, Europe doesn't have much free speech because of that, or is it like, hey, this is extreme situations and free speech is like not a binary?
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, really interesting in that, the Europe in general. I mean, they've suffered a lot because of, you could argue, free speech to some degree, right? The actual rise of the Nazis, the ability to say that one race is, inferior to another. It would be protected in the U.S., but and maybe at that time it was protected in Europe or in Germany, but a lot of people died because of that, and so you can see why they have some scar tissue around this subject, and so I think actually being racist in UK is banned, right? So, but I mean, can't you see why they have a good reason for ban? I mean, I know there's free speech people in the US that say that's a it's a feature, not a bug that we have, that you can protect that speech. But it seems to me like there's some forms of speech that are, unequivocally bad.
Yeah, like if you take this UK thing, right? Like, there has been a ton of immigrants into the UK. And yeah, I'm an immigrant to the UK, so I empathize with them, but like I also believe that we should have, I know we kind of disagree on this to some extent, but I also believe you should have like controlled immigration, and there's like a certain stable rate of like adding people to a population that like doesn't like screw up services, lead to homelessness and like all this kind of stuff. And in many ways, the UK crossed that. So I think like it is reasonable to want to like make a point about that and like do a protest, right? Like when it goes into rioting and threatening people, etc., that's bad. So even in that small case, you can see like, hey, actually, like they're calling it hate speech, but they're really suppressing protest, which, I believe any democracy should have the right to protest. Any law that you make, it's very easy for politicians to abuse it. Actually, America's kind of funny because like whatever laws that exist, politicians are really good at abusing them. Whereas like I think Europe sometimes like they have laws, but they don't abuse them as much. It's just very easy for us to like say, reasonable thing like, hey, they don't want Nazis, so they should ban hate speech. But that then gets abused by a subsequent like government 50 years later or 40 years, whatever it is. So I do believe that like laws should be a little bit more extreme to protect certain things, because like abuse is going to happen otherwise. Like it's reasonable to say, yeah, they should like not be racist. But then like you make that law and it starts getting applied to situations that like it wasn't intended for because the ambiguity line is quite broad.
Yeah, so that's a slippery slope argument, which I don't fully buy. I think
it's not a slippery slope argument. It's like the ambiguity of it all. Like,
Yeah.
how do you do like something like hate speech is like it's just so ambiguous that's too hard to define. I mean, there is a definition, but it's not great.
I don't think there's like a lot of valid forms of speech being banned in Europe. Like, I don't think like, Germany, for example, has pretty strong laws against Nazi supporting speech right now. It's not like there's a bunch of speech that's like being banned that's like you and I would consider legitimate speech. Yeah, I think it's actually working. The laws actually probably work decently well.
Yeah, you're building a new social app. Do you worry about like its usage in another country, and now you have to obey the laws of that country? I mean, like, I have a pretty reasonable idea, and you probably have a reasonable idea of like US laws when it comes to like a social app. But what are the French laws when it comes to social apps? What are the EU laws? What are the Dubai laws? Like, I have no idea. But like, do you think like, hey, let's just keep it a US only app and make your life simpler, or are you kind of thinking deal with it when you hit enough scale to like be in those countries?
Yeah, I think there's a simple solution here, which is like just pull out of the country whose laws you don't and like you can just like shut off your
But
app.
as a small startup, like, are you gonna go look at every country's laws and decide that, or?
Not today, but like as things grow, you have the option, right? You can actually see like which countries are like sending you subpoenas or like railing against your apps, or maybe you can say I just don't want to be part of that country, like Google did in China. I mean, Google just pulled out of China, and they said I'd rather be make less money, not serving this huge market, than like try to compromise or try to like either break the law of China or work with the government.
If the world is like that, where you have to go look at every region and decide, like, do you want to do a consumer app there? Do you want to do an AI app there? I think there's several big AI companies that pulled out of Europe because the AI laws are, in their opinion, at least draconian. Do we end up with like a smaller, balkanized startup market where there's a different app in India, there's a different app in China, there's a different app in Europe, there's a different app in the US?
I mean, look at TikTok, right? Like, TikTok is a prime example of an app that maybe in the '90s or early 2000s would be like commonplace all over the world. Now it's banned in India, right? It's like I think banned in other countries too. It's on the path of being banned in the U.S. for political reasons, right? Largely. So yeah, I think absolutely we're on the path to balkanization. We have to also understand, like, these governments. I would agree with you that it's unfortunate that they kind of own their countries, and they're preventing universality of like experience. But it's just the way of the world. I don't think there's a way to prevent it. I think we should just accept it that that's going to happen, and companies have to navigate a patchwork of laws, and they'll have to make real decisions over which countries they want to work with and which ones they don't. I think that's just a reality. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's inevitable. But I'm curious about Mercury. How do you guys only work in the U.S. today?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, banking is already extremely regional, right? Like, you need a banking license in every country you operate in, or you need to work with a bank in every country you operate in, or you need, and then on top of that, there's different payment rails in each country or region. There's different regulations and compliance needs. So actually, it's like, yeah, we always think about it. We're like, yeah, Mercury has reasonable scale. Should we launch outside the US? But it's just so much work. And, at least when it comes to banking, most other like regions are much smaller or much harder to penetrate. Like EU is actually like a comparatively big region with like a homogenized banking laws, but you have to go per country. So every time we look at it, it's better to go increase our penetration in the US or go expand the types of customers we can serve in the US rather than go expand outside the US. Although it's always interesting to think about, and lots of our customers ask us, Canada, UK, like it's very easy to go, hey, we have an app, let's go apply it, and we would get a customer base relatively quickly. But it is very tricky to think about, and actually we haven't talked about this, but a lot of countries are protectionist when it comes to banking. Like they don't want foreign banks or foreign fintechs to like own a large part of their banking ecosystem. And I think there is an element of that in this like regulatory landscape. Like, yeah, obviously China doesn't want international social companies for like maybe free speech and other reasons. But I think there is also an element of like they want their local companies to do really well and own the consumer market and then grow globally. So yeah, I think banking has always had that.
Yeah. Well, someone said in the last episode that they like companies that go after regulated markets. So that's a reason for you to go after these international
Yeah.
regulated markets, fight the regulations. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We wanted to briefly talk about Nvidia. They just released their earnings. Yeah, the earnings actually were pretty good. They did a beat. Uh, so Q2 revenue up 122% year on year to 30 billion, which is actually kind of insane. Basically, they were doing 14 billion a year ago, and now they're doing 30 billion. And a year ago, it was already elevated. And they beat estimates by 28.7 billion. But then the stock went down, actually went down like 9-ish% in last night, but then it's back up again. So it's only down 3.5% today. So it's now a $2.98 trillion company. And the reason it's down is because the next forecast that they're predicting in the future is not as aggressive as the like every quarter so far they've like predicted a forecast that's beat the previous prediction by a very significant margin, whereas this time they're saying, hey, we're going to beat the previous prediction but just not by as much. It kind of goes to show you like it is like people are kind of like ready to like either bail or like we're like deep in this AI bubble now for a company to be worth like 3 trillion and to have grown so fast into that. Like what is it's 148% up year on year. Do you own any Nvidia stock? Like, what's your feeling on it?
Yeah, I do own some Nvidia. I own some ARM. I own like a diverse set of like chip stocks. How about you?
I bought some like a year and a half ago. I sold a little bit, but I am definitely nervous, right? Where does it go from 3 trillion? Partly I'm just holding on to it so I can have it for more than a year and get like long-term capital gains. But yeah, I'm nervous. Like I just don't see where it goes. Like maybe it'll go up a little bit more.
Well, yeah, the central question seems to be amongst the investor class is like, okay, are people going to find, any uses for all this compute, or is it like, going to be a bubble? And I think there's a real good question about that. I mean, if you look at the cost of like compute has dropped dramatically, right, over the last year and a half. The cost of tokens, right, from all the major companies, there needs to be at some point real value created by that spend.
Yeah, so Sequoia did a post June 20th where they say AI is $600 billion question. And Altimeter and Goldman Sachs did a similar post, which is like, with all of this investment we've had, we basically need to create like 600 billion in like yearly revenue. I think OpenAI is doing, what was their last 3 billion a year or something like that. So there seems to be a big gap between like, where do we get it? And yeah, the normal way these kind of bubbles go is like we overinvest.
Yes.
Yeah, it turns out to be a bad idea for the first kind of 3-4 years, and then 10 years later, everyone's like, "Wow, it really worked." And yeah, I feel like we're getting close to that kind of 3-4 year thing where it's the trough of sorrow, and everyone's like, "AI was pointless, and we've gone too far," and all of this kind of stuff.
I am sure we're going to enter that phase. Yeah, I think in the next year or two, there's going to be a lot of people who said the AI thing was overhyped. And like AI would just kind of exist, but a lot of the companies working on new AI applications will take some time to hit their stride. I think there are all going to be some really novel, exciting AI applications, but they're just it's too early to tell. And I think AI will be a major like tailwind for existing companies as well. But there hasn't really been, I think, probably a material revenue increase to date. And I think it will take some time for that to see. I mean, do you know of any other company apart from Nvidia, like any software companies that have seen major gains from AI to date?
Well, so the hyperscalers like AWS, Google Cloud, etc. They have seen, and Microsoft Azure, they have seen gains. But it's really like I don't want to call it a pyramid scheme, but it's a little bit of a pyramid scheme. Like, Nvidia makes the chips, these guys buy the chips, and then everyone's trying to get into AI, and they're like spending a lot on the chips via these people. So, yeah, really, like their revenue gains are basically just like the same as the Nvidia revenue gains. But their ones are more risky because they've done this capital outlay, so they have to convert it into like a long-term profit, whereas Nvidia is just making a margin every time they do.
Yeah, I think those are decent examples. Microsoft, we used to use Azure AI in our last company, and it's they did a really good job at building AI applications around voice and stuff like that.
Well, you used Azure AI like after OpenAI was integrated, or was this like a pre-OpenAI kind of Azure AI?
It was pre-OpenAI actually, pre-ChatGPT, I would say. And Azure, we used Azure for like ASR, like automated speech recognition, so converting speech to text, and it was a really good API. And even at the time, which is like 2022 or so, I was shocked at how good it was and how little people in Silicon Valley were talking about it. At that time, this was ChatGPT. Now everyone's talking about how good voice AI is. I think those APIs that are developed, they're definitely going to see major revenue increase like these. But its question is like, is it going to keep growing if they can't find good applications for it?
Yeah, at the end of the day, for the level of investments, we need like significant productivity gains across the whole GDP of the country, right? Like, I was at a Jensen talk, where it's basically the bet is like AI is going to increase productivity by, maybe 1 or 2% on a compounding basis in the world economy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're very far from like proving that out. I mean, I think it could, right? Like we're basically talking about replacing intelligence.
What's global GDP at? What percentage? I'm trying to do the math on what 600 billion would be as a percentage of global GDP.
Well, I think it's like a complicated. It's about 100 trillion in 2022. So 600 billion is not too much.
It's not too bad, right? It's like
sure.
0.6%.
Yeah, a lot of global GDP is people getting oil out of the ground.
But if you could do that, 5% more efficiently, if you can get oil out of the ground a little bit better,
I guess if you create a scientific discovery and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. I guess
it should. It should create 5% of productivity gains. So it's just a question is how long it takes.
And actually, those kind of things where we're talking about getting oil out of the ground, or even healthcare things like improving doctors, like those take a long time to play out, right? Because we need AI good enough, then it needs to come up with a productivity gain. Then we need to deploy it across Saudi Arabia / whatever, all these countries. Like that is going to take years. And like, I mean, that is the exciting thing about AI. Maybe we'll have, if you look at that kind of graph of GDP growth in the world, right? It's this like crazy exponential. And every decade we have to go like, how are we going to get like another 50% in the next 2 decades? And maybe AI is that, but yeah, it'll take a long time to play out. People are buying Nvidia like it's going to happen in the next 3 years.
Yeah. I saw this debate on Twitter. I want to get your thoughts on it. Aaron Levy was saying that basically that the AI productivity gains would largely be created by bigger companies, incumbents. Obviously, he runs Box, which is an incumbent. And Paul Graham was, disagreeing, and he thought a lot of it would come from startups. What's your take on that?
The thing is, and I think sometimes people forget this kind of concept, is like, it's $600 billion, let's just say. Sure, maybe 500 billion goes to the big companies, or even like 550 billion goes to the big company. 50 billion is more than enough to work with in the startup ecosystem, right? I mean, to make $1 trillion company, you need to get 10 billion. So you could have $2 trillion companies, and still the majority of the AI gains go to the incumbents. So I think there's more than enough to work with. I would also say, and I think sometimes people forget this, is there's just a lot of really crappy incumbents out there, right? Every industry has these companies that are 40, 50 years old that still do billions of dollars in revenue. And the thing that AI does is, it's not necessarily going to be an AI construction company or something. It'll be a construction company that uses AI better than, I'm just picking construction, but let's just say construction software, and I'm sure there's lots of billion-dollar revenue companies there. It'll be a company that is going to beat those companies potentially anyway, but now it's got AI as like a new way to sell, a better way to like make a product. It's more efficient in every way. And like those incumbents are not going to be able to utilize it. Sure, like Aaron is still, at Box, and they still have great software engineers, and they can go, use AI, but that's a rare-ish set of companies. And I think there's tons of companies globally across every industry that will get disrupted, and AI will be one of the reasons they get disrupted. Maybe not the only one, like that's going to happen anyway. I actually think we're in that phase of AI. Like if I look at kind of the investments I'm making, we're no longer as much in the picks and shovels side of AI, like, whether it's the models or the infrastructure play. I think we're in the apps phase. And a lot of the apps are like, I'm like, okay, AI is a part of the proposition, but it's not AI first. It's like AI is kind of becoming like mobile or cloud. It's just, yeah, of course you're going to have a mobile app, and of course you're going to be in the cloud, and of course you're going to have some AI features. It's not a defining thing. It's just part of the mix. And I just don't see how those companies are not going to disrupt like these old school incumbents.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the fundamentals of startup investing are the same. Find great founders who know how to, get distribution, build great value in markets. AI is a tailwind, I think, from like a speed to market perspective or a speed of innovation perspective for a startup versus an incumbent. As you said, a lot of incumbents are very poor, and a startup can just make new features, make new products faster. So that gives them an edge against an incumbent who's still trying to figure things out. I mean, just look at OpenAI versus Google, right? Like, the speed at which OpenAI is executing is much faster than, all the, I would say, the big incumbents. And similar is true for some of the other companies too.
I think the other thing that sometimes people miss is that, it's hard to sell. Like if you're selling B2B, it's hard. And if you've got some cool sounding feature, right, it can open the door, right? Everyone's looking, if you look at the buyer, they have a boring like life potentially. And you come there and you're a startup and you're like, hey, here's a cool like AI feature as part of this product that's going to improve your life. It's going to improve the people working at your company's lives. That's just a fun thing. Like they want to hear about it. It opens the door. And actually, like, I think sometimes it's done in a non-tasteful way, where people just pretend they have AI. But there's a lot of companies that like are being forced to have AI features because they know it increases sales efficiency. So that's not something, especially in B2B, it's not something you can ignore.
No, absolutely. Yeah. The ability to sell things like building a sales team and understanding your market and getting into the right people these are timeless skills that startups need. So,
yeah. So you're going to sell your Nvidia stock or you're hodling?
Yeah, I'm holding. I'm just a long-term believer. So I think it probably will go down. I think it will go down. But generally,
when you say you're a long-term believer, you think $3 trillion is going to go higher in the long term, even though there's so many other people trying to get into the chips game. Like Google has TPUs, etc. You still think that like they can hold on to like a long-term kind of like differentiation?
So first of all, I still hold my Google stock from like 15 years ago. So like I hold things for a really long time. I think Nvidia just fits like my general kind of model of like a founder-led company. So like for any founder-led public company, I think you should just hold the stock. If it's a good founder, you just keep it, and good things happen. There's a bunch of those out there, and you can kind of depend on Jensen to compete with Google and other people, I think. Now, and there's rate cuts coming. So rate cuts are going to boost the market in general. So
I just feel like those are priced in. They've been priced in all year because everyone was like, there'll be 7 rate cuts this year. And I have a hard time believing.
Hey, if Trump wins, there'll be way more than 7. But yeah, there'll be a lot of rate cuts.
Well, the funny thing was the narrative shifted where for a while it was like rate cuts are coming and that's positive. And every time there was like a slightly bad employment outlook or something like that, everyone was like, oh wow, we're going to get rate cuts. Now everyone's worried about recession again. So whenever there's some bad news, people are like, oh, we might get rate cuts, but maybe it's a recession. So I find these narratives are like kind of funny. Like it's just people always trying to put stories around these kind of somewhat.
Sounds like you're going to take some money off the table then with Nvidia.
I'm really nervous, but I'm still holding for now. I may be a long-term believer, but at 3 trillion, like I also said this at 2 trillion, so it's just, where can this go? I remember the first company that became $1 trillion company. I guess it was Apple. I was just like, I can't see how this goes.
It was just a few years ago, right? Like 5 years ago.
Yeah, it was only a few years ago. Yeah. I guess that's like, maybe that's asset inflation.
We'll be doing this podcast in a couple of years, and they'll be like, Nvidia's at 10 trillion.
It'll be 5 trillion or 10 trillion. We'll look like idiots. All right, I think we can wrap up with that. Really good chat. See you all next week.
Thanks for listening to the Founders in Arms podcast. We are available on all the major podcast streaming channels, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc. We also now have a group chat on a new social app, a group chat app that actually I helped build, and it's available on Tribe. And if you're into the podcast, come join the group chat, share your feedback, and also get a chance to be on the same group chat as me and Imad. And we'd love to just hear more feedback from you and hear your ideas for who you'd like to have on the show and what topics you'd like us to discuss. And we'll also have some exclusive content on there, maybe some sneak peeks or other clips maybe deleted clips. We could put on there. It's just an experiment. We're trying it out, so we'd love to have you on there.
Yeah, the link will be in the show notes.